protecting the institution of slavery. And that was the route that they took in 1861. And this will kind of ebb and flow throughout the course of the Civil War. And so there's, as the war develops, first and foremost, there is conditional unionists, which is kind of an interesting term to think about. And a lot of Kentuckians, especially the wealthy, powerful political might of the state, are conditional unionists. Like, we will stay in the union as long as the federal government observes these laws, including the institution of slavery protected by the Constitution, right? But war, as I think a lot of us know, breaks down order, social order, and it breaks down political order and establishment as well. And so you're going to see this shift towards 1862, 1863, where you've got this, it's kind of the elephant in a room. What are we going to do about slavery? We need to protect it at all costs. But on the ground level, you've got U.S. Army troops that are running into enslaved people. Enslaved people are coming into federal line. And so there has to be something figured out here, right? And Camp Nelson proves to be kind of a microcosm of the, I call it the interaction between slavery, emancipation, military policy, all at the same time.
Interesting. That's a really fascinating way of framing it. And kind of based on what you were saying, it sounds like there's several different perspectives in Kentucky at this time. So it sounds like there's white pro-slavery people who are thinking that they'll support the Union on the condition that slavery will be basically kept or retained. There's the US government or the Army who kind of expects Kentucky to swear allegiance whether slavery is upheld or not. But then you have enslaved Americans who are seeing this as an opportunity to self-emancipate when they come across US Army troops. So, and that's kind of the perspective I want to dig into a little bit. So we've got President Abraham Lincoln, who is basically passing the Emancipation Proclamation in September of 1862. Now that frees enslaved people in the Confederacy, but does that apply to Kentucky, or what's the situation with folks there?
It was written specifically to keep out the border states, and Lincoln understood this as commander in chief. He only had, powers to do certain things, right? And he understood that the southern states that were in rebellion against the United States, he could take away their basically human property, which they were using to fuel this war. But Kentucky, Delaware, Maryland, and Missouri were not in rebellion against the United States. He could not touch federal law in that way, especially the Constitution. But with the issue, with the official issue of the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, things start changing, including in Kentucky, even though it does not, directly affect Kentucky policy-wise. There's a lot of Kentuckians who are very uneasy about this, and that's why you get this kind of uproar from the conditional unionists being like, hey, what's going on here? There was a great fear that the US Army at some point would start recruiting African-American soldiers from the enslaved population in Kentucky. And as enslaved African-American men, they realized they could not enlist in the US Army in Kentucky in 1863. So they went to neighboring states. And so you kind of see this breakdown happen, right? And this comes at the same time that Camp Nelson is established in really kind of the late spring, early summer of 1863 as a supply depot. I call it a forward operating base for the US Army to operate into points further south, especially East Tennessee, Georgia, and things like that, places like that, right? And so it really, first and foremost, is a military site. A site of military necessity for to fuel basically operations in the field. But in order to protect the site, really establish the site, the U.S. Army actually turned to enslaved African Americans. And so there were African Americans enslaved around these counties in central Kentucky, and they were impressed by the U.S. Army to expand the road system. We call it the Lexington-Danville Turnpike, or they did back then. We call it US 27 today, the highway. And our park is established right east of the highway as you go down from Lexington. And almost immediately, you can see it right there, right? African Americans are directly connected to Camp Nelson. They are contributing to its defense. They build the earthworks that protect protected the camp. And then, so that was kind of the beginning, right? Interestingly enough, obviously the federal government compensated enslavers for their human property. And so that was okay. If you use our labor, you have to compensate for this, and you have to return them in time for the harvest, right? And so, but that was beginning of the breakdown. And I think it's important for people to understand that war changes things. So in 1861, they're not going to touch slavery in Kentucky. Not 62, not 63 in a way, right? Where the government will start compensating for their labor. By 1864, it's an election year. And I like to use an analogy. Lincoln and his commanders, they push all the chips in the center of the table. They have to win this war. Lincoln's up for re-election, right, in November of 1864. He understands this. He has to prove to the American public in the North that they're making tangible steps towards winning this war, crushing this rebellion. And if that means enlisting African-American soldiers in the border states, we're going to do it.
Interesting. So the Emancipation Proclamation does not apply to the border states, including Kentucky.
That's correct. Yes.
Okay. So enslaved people in Kentucky are not freed by this. So how were they seeking freedom? Because I'm assuming, many were attempting to self-emancipate. So what did that process look like, and what did it mean for their families?
That's a great question, Katie. And I think it depends on where you were at, where these people were at. Proximity, especially to the U.S. Army, was important. And we see this breakdown throughout the country during the Civil War, wherever the U.S. Army was, and there's an internal struggle between U.S. Army regiments as well. There are members of regiments that want to see the destruction of slavery. Others, get these people out of our camp. And there's accounts in Kentucky and when I was in DC, from Maryland was a border state as well. And, enslavers were allowed to come to camp to retrieve their human property. That happened all the time. And especially early during the Civil War, but you see soldiers are experiencing this for the first time, especially soldiers from the North. And this is really their first experience with seeing slavery on the ground, right? And some will start changing their attitudes in a way. I think a lot of it is practical. A lot of officers are hiring enslaved young men to be like camp servants and cooks and things like that. But you see this opportunity for enslaved people to self-emancipate with the U.S. Army, okay? And it will happen really in 1864 in Kentucky. And so this is when we had this idea of this concept of conditional unionists. This completely turns against Abraham Lincoln in 1864. And I want to give people an idea of what this looks like. Lincoln's up for re-election as a Republican candidate, right? And he's going against his former general, George McClellan, who's a Democrat, who promises to, defeat the rebellion, but basically leave the Constitution as it is. And that actually was the political slogan they used: the Constitution as it is, the Union as it was. I mean, that tells you everything you need to know. Do not touch the Constitution because it protects the institution of slavery. And let's kind of bring this country back together as it was, right? And so that was the slogan that was used. And I don't think you're surprised. I think when you hear more about this, Lincoln was defeated in Kentucky, one of only 3 states that voted for George McClellan, actually. And he received 70% of the popular vote in the state. So you can imagine there was a growing uproar from the conditional unionists. And then there was also, from the opposite side, there was the unconditional unionists who said we need to, operate this war whatever means possible, necessary, right? So if that means the enlistment of African-American soldiers, that will take place. And we start seeing that really in late April, May, June of 1864, when African-American men start arriving at Camp Nelson. And at this point, the Army brings them in, allows them to enlist to serve in the U.S. military. And I want to backtrack real quickly, Katie. There was a process to this. By the end of 1863, when Kentuckians realized that they couldn't really stop this momentum of Black enlistment, there was a lot of conversations being had between the federal government and politicians in Kentucky. And one of the things they thought about is like, well, if you enlist Black men, you have to compensate them. You have to compensate for them, so pay us, and they cannot serve in Kentucky and they cannot train in Kentucky, and they cannot wear the U.S. Army uniform. Obviously, the sight of Black men like Samuel Trueheart right here wearing the federal blues was just too much. And so there was this kind of, give and take kind of conversation, trying to come up with some sort of solution. But by 1864, as I said, all chips were in the center of the table. They needed men, and 10,000 Black men will be recruited. 4 regiments that are organized at Camp Nelson, about 5,000 to 7,000 will be recruited directly at Camp Nelson, and about 23,000 will enlist in the U.S. military from the state of Kentucky during the Civil War, which is a very large number. The enslaved population in Kentucky at the beginning of 1860 was about 250,000, about 225,000.
Can you tell us a little bit more about, so I'm getting the sense from you, correct me if I'm wrong, that this process of emancipation, self-emancipation, it's not a blanket experience by any means. It's happening, at different times in different places. As you mentioned, it really depends on where you are in the country at the time. So what is happening in terms of the Emancipation Proclamation? I'm assuming when the Union wins the war that people in the Confederacy, enslaved people, are freed. Now, that is something that's referred to as Juneteenth. It's a federal holiday now. And that's something actually that Montpelier celebrates as well. And these are some photos of Juneteenth celebrations at Montpelier from 2019. So that's a really important kind of event, descendant-led event at Montpelier. So that's something I think some of our callers may know about. Now, Virginia was part of the Confederacy. As enslaved people in Kentucky, same rules aren't applying. So can you give us a little bit more information about what's happening in regard to, freedom for them?
Absolutely. And I think that's a great point, because I think this is really relevant, this conversation, right? With this federal holiday celebrating Juneteenth Day, really, Emancipation Day in Texas, which was really the enforcement of the Emancipation Proclamation in the state of Texas, Galveston. And think about June of 1865, there just wasn't, up until that point, there was not a lot of federal presence in that area of the country. There was so many military campaigns going on from really the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. That's where the focus of military campaigns will be. It's not until June of 1865 where the U.S. Army will issue general orders, emancipation. This is Juneteenth Day, which was celebrated by obviously enslaved people in Texas, and it's spread from there. Interestingly enough, you talk about Juneteenth programs, and I've been a part of organizing these in DC the past several years, and I like to call it Emancipation Day, actually, whatever that may be. And I think historians are starting to understand that emancipation took place in many different forms, in many different places across the country. As we talked about proximity, wherever you were at, if you had an opportunity, enslaved people did. If they had an opportunity, might self-emancipate, they might not, right? And so in Washington, D.C. is a great example. The District of Columbia, there was an enslaved population in the district, and the federal government paid to emancipate the enslaved people in the city. And listen to the name of the bill, right? The Compensated Emancipation Act. That it tells you exactly what it is. The federal government paid enslavers to basically free their human bondage, right? And that happened in April of 1862. So this is before the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in September of 1862. This is before the official Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. And so there was already enslaved people that were emancipated long before some of these, more notable actions did happen. And then, of course, we have to talk about Kentucky. What about Kentucky? There are other states, the border states of Missouri, I know Maryland, abolished slavery, I believe in 1864. Kentucky still resisted that, even after the enlistment of over 23,000 Black men at U.S. Army recruiting bases across the state. But I think it's important to mention that there the family members, the wives, children, sisters, mothers of these Black soldiers who often accompanied them into federal lines were considered refugees. They had no status as freed people. They had no status as so-called contraband, which you saw in the southern states that came, African Americans that came in from the rebellious states were considered contraband of war, but not the border states, right? And so, what is their status? Well, not until March of 1865 does Congress pass legislation emancipating the family members of Black soldiers. And that came after some horrific incidents at Camp Nelson. We call them the expulsions, where the US Army forcibly expelled Black refugees from the federal lines at Camp Nelson. The worst incident happened in November of 1864, and over 100 people had died as a result, including, believe it or not, family members of Black soldiers. I mean, it's as dark and horrific as it gets, but it does inspire this legislation that will emancipate, family members of Black soldiers in 1865, early 1865. But, the war ends April, May, June, into July of 1865. Major military operations are over. There are still enslaved people in the United States. And I think that's critically important to understand. As Elizabeth mentioned at the beginning of the program, not in Kentucky and Delaware, slavery was not abolished until the ratification of the 13th Amendment on December 6th, 1865, long after Lincoln's dead, long after the surrenders of Lee and Johnston in the spring and summer of 1865. And Kentucky did not ratify that until 1976. To give you some context here. So I think it's important that we celebrate, obviously, a federal holiday like Juneteenth Day, but we should also celebrate Emancipation Day, whether that be January 1st, whether it be December 13th, June 13th, August 15th, right? Every single day was Emancipation Day during the Civil War.
And I know Elizabeth mentioned that, she didn't know too much about the Civil War. I'm also, I think we are very much in the 1700s at Montpelier. That's kind of where our brains are at most of the time. So I can tell you a lot about that, but I have less of an understanding about, the nuances and complexities of the Civil War. And so I just want to make sure I understood you right. So slavery actually still existed in the United States even after the Civil War was over.
That's correct. Yes, until the ratification of the 13th Amendment. And I think, for people, for the general public especially, that's starting to learn about these kind of much more complex, deeper conversations that we're having about not only the Civil War, but the legacy of the Civil War. We like to say Civil War to civil rights and beyond, right? This conversation continues, and it's really relevant. And you can see that. I think if people watch the film like Lincoln, there's, he talks, it's really interesting. There's a lot of long scenes with a lot of deep dialogue, but it's really compelling because it shows even within Lincoln's own administration, this argument over what's going to happen with slavery, right? And so some of his cabinet members saying, well, you issued the Emancipation Proclamation, so it doesn't matter. You're good to go, right? And, his Attorney General Bates says, well, it's a military measure. When that's over, when the war is over, what does that mean for people that are still enslaved? What does that mean for people that were so-called emancipated? Do they return to slavery, right? And so Lincoln makes this great point, like in order for this sacrifices to really stick, like we have to pass an amendment to officially abolish slavery. So obviously we're talking about, if we're talking about legacies of the Constitution, the war is trying to determine what the legacy of the Constitution is. And so if we have to write an amendment to change the Constitution, we're going to do that. And that was done with the 13th Amendment.
And you've kind of, I think, weaved this thread throughout what you've been talking about. So United States colored troops were not just fighting for freedom from slavery, but also for kind of participation in greater society. I think it really makes one think about, what does freedom mean? So it's not just freedom from bondage, but it's being able to be part of this American society. So I do think that's a very relevant topic today. I think that's something that's a legacy of the Constitution, that we are always negotiating and renegotiating as a country. So I'm curious to know what happened to those refugees at Camp Nelson after the Civil War, and what post Civil War looked like for African Americans on the legal landscape. Because I know you mentioned the 13th Amendment, but more generally, kind of participation in society, freedmen's participation in society.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have heard this Frederick Douglass quote. He talks about, once a black man like wears the uniform with the brass eagle and carries bullets in his pocket. uh, There's no force on earth that can deny that he's earned the right of citizenship. I think that's critically important to understand. He talks about this idea of citizenship. So what exactly does citizenship mean? Well, I think it meant something much different. Well, it was contested back then as it is contested now, right? And so this idea of, especially for African-American men with the passage of the 15th Amendment, another change to the Constitution, the right to vote, the franchise, right? It's basically you can dictate not only, I would say, your own future, but what you want to see the political future of your county or state is, right? And the right to buy property, the right to marry, right? There are all these kind of inalienable citizenship rights, natural rights that these men are fighting for, as are their families as well, right? And I think for African-American men especially, this, service in the United States military, I think is obviously very honorable. They're fighting for deeper meaning, like citizenship, the right to vote, the right to own property, things like that. But I also think it's very practical. They're getting paid. They're being clothed. They're provided provisions, and it's constant as well. So a lot of the United States colored troops in 1867 or 1866, 1867, when the Army is reorganized to include African American regiments, regular Army regiments, for the first time in American military history, a lot of former Civil War Black soldiers become US Army regular soldiers, and we now know them as the Buffalo Soldiers. And so the first generation of the Buffalo Soldiers, a large percentage are Civil War veterans, and some will stay in the Army for 20 or 30 years after the Civil War, and they'll be joined by their families. And let me give you, the Army realized this as well. There's originally 6 regiments, and it was reduced to 4, or reorganized to 4. Prior to the Civil War, with the US Army, especially for military posts out west, there generally would be a chaplain assigned to each military post. This was not done with the Black regiments. They assigned a chaplain per regiment because the chaplain provided not only religious services, but educational services as well. So even the federal government, the military realized that, right? And so you kind of see this next step. We've had emancipation. What's the next step after? We're obviously very uncertain. What happens at Camp Nelson? Well, in 1865, there is the home for colored refugees that's established really to the southwest of the main military camp. And you can see this image here of, formerly enslaved children, young people being educated by, white Americans that really come from a lot of relief societies up north. And this site will be maintained, the military site and the school for colored refugees and the home for colored refugees will be maintained until 1866, and everything is dismantled. 300 buildings, 4,000 acres gone. So what will become of a lot of these people? Well, a lot of people move. They're in search of family members. They're in search of probably, I have this sense of more opportunities, right? So you'll see a lot of African Americans, former refugees, former soldiers go north. They'll cross the Potomac, Ohio River and go into the state of Ohio and other states in the Midwest. We know in the 1870s, many go out west, the American West, and become, the famous exodusters, right? These Black settlers out west. And there's a small community that will stay at the site of the former home for colored refugees, and they'll purchase some property, and it'll become the community known as Ariel, and that's ebbed and flowed over the last century and a half or so, but it's now called the Hall community. One of our sites is over there, the Fee Memorial Church, which was built in the early 19 teens. but it was a replacement for the original church that was there. And there are actually direct descendants of USCT soldiers and refugees that live in that community. So intimately connected, literally just across the road from our main visitor center is this really, really important fabric of not only Camp Nelson history, but Kentucky history and American history as well.
That's really interesting that there's folks that, can connect their history back to, this period in time where their ancestors are fighting in this war. And I think the way that you've talked about it this evening is interesting, and I appreciate it, particularly because it's getting at these nuances. So again, I mean, I didn't know very much about the Civil War. I assumed enslaved people got emancipation after the war. And obviously, it's much more complex. And I think understanding that complexity is, one aspect to your job, but being able to communicate that to a
Right.
public audience is, a whole nother challenge in and of itself. And as Elizabeth said, she introduced you and gave, your introduction. You have a lot of experience in interpretation at a number of different park units. So, you're currently chief of interpretation at Camp Nelson National Monument. You worked as chief of interp at Charles Young Buffalo Soldier National Monument, which is also a newer site about his story, being a Buffalo soldier and, a freedman as well. So, you're kind of well versed in not just the scholarship, but also how to tell these stories. So I'm just curious, kind of what's your strategy in trying to communicate the nuances of the past in a way that, everybody can understand, no matter, what your education level is, your age, your background, how do you do that?
That's a really great question. I think this, as we're public historians, we work at historic sites that are frequented by the public, right? And so how do we have these conversations with the public, right? And I think that's been a question asked by, frontline interpretive staff and historians for decades, right? I mean, what is this conversation going to look like? What stories do we want to share? And I think, for something as complicated as the Civil War, I kind of refer to as we've had this traditional narrative of the Civil War, right? Of the military tactics, the battles and leaders, and very heroic, right? Kind of remembrance of the Civil War. And I think obviously in the last several decades, there's been, I understand people charge that, historians are changing history. They're changing the stories. And I obviously vehemently disagree. I believe we are expanding the narrative. So Camp Nelson, has been there for 150 years, 160 years, actually, right? And I think for a lot of people don't know about Camp Nelson. They don't know that it was an army base. They don't know that it was a recruitment center and a refugee camp as well, right? And so I think it's our job as frontline public historians is to amplify the voices and the narratives of these people, whatever way we can. So, they have experiences, right? They had trials and tribulations. They experienced the American Civil War and escaping slavery and seeking freedom, obviously on a very personal scale, but there is a legacy to that as well, right? And so I like to use our cultural spaces or even our natural spaces to share these stories. And I'll give you an example of that, right? In Washington, D.C., and I guess I kind of make a similar comparison to Camp Nelson in many ways, because when I tell people I work at a Civil War site or I'm a Civil War historian, they ask me what battlefield I work at, right? Or what's your favorite battle, which I understand, of course, but there's not a battle at Camp Nelson. There was 3+ years of very intense, interaction between human beings from all different, aspects of life: soldiers, civilians, refugees, black, white, you name it. It all occurred at Camp Nelson, right? And we do have records of that with some of the written records, obviously archaeological records as well. In Washington, D.C., we have 4 years of intense Civil War history, of course. And I think people think of, obviously, the Lincoln administration, the War Department, of course, that makes sense. We have a small battle in 1864, but I was really interested in the daily interaction between soldiers and the civilians, especially enslaved people coming into the city. I worked at the defenses of Washington, and there was a system of fortifications that protected the Capitol. So if you can just walk into the city, there could be, you could be an enemy combatant, right? And so people were stopped at the forts. For enslaved people, these fortifications became beacons for them to escape enslavement from. And obviously, for a lot of these enslaved people, we don't have a written record of it, but we do have records from the soldiers, either personal letters or records or biographies, but also regimental histories as well. And so I started diving into these regimental histories. I'm like, oh my gosh, there are so many accounts of enslaved people coming into federal lines. As I mentioned, there was a lot of internal strife between the soldiers themselves. Some wanted to see the destruction of slavery, others did not, right? And so it was really kind of interesting. It's a microcosm of what the war was about on the ground level. And a lot of these sites that we maintain in the National Park Service in DC are modern sites now, right? You might see a neighborhood there. You might see a Civil War monument there. And so my goal was to invite people out to these spaces. We talk about maybe the monument for a couple of minutes, but then we'd really talk about the stories, right? And so I think that's what's critically important, and it's relevant as well. And let me kind of share one more example. When I did this emancipation program this past June in DC, it was at the African American Civil War Memorial in DC, right off U Street, or a little bit north of Logan Circle, managed by the National Park Service, by the way. We administer that site. It's right across the street from the African American Civil War Museum. And it includes the name of every single Black soldier that enlisted in the US military, including all 10,000 soldiers that enlisted at Camp Nelson, right? And so we did this program. I didn't call it Juneteenth Day. I called it Emancipation in Civil War Washington, right? Because as I mentioned, we wanted to talk about the Compensated Emancipation Act, but then we also talked about the Emancipation Proclamation, Juneteenth Day, and the 13th Amendment, right? So all these different layers. And when you have these programs and you can connect and communicate with people, you hear their stories as well. And I think one of my greatest takeaways, there was an African-American woman from Texas, and she said, we've been celebrating Juneteenth Day my entire life. My family's been doing it for generations. I had no idea about, DC emancipation. I didn't know that there were still people that were slaves in late 1865, right? So I think that's a big part of it. And then obviously engaging genuinely and forging a genuine, trustful relationship with the community as well. So we're building a brand new national park, Katie, and I know I shared that with Elizabeth as well. It's very exciting. And, we're new on the ground here. The Jessamine County did a really great job of setting the foundation, but we're kind of building it up from that point. And we have a lot of stakeholders and shareholders that we want to be involved in not only the conversation, but in the planning process as well. And so hearing their voices is critically important, right? So we've been collaborating with African-American churches and other groups around the park, and they've been not only we had this Luminaria event to commemorate, or I guess to memorialize the expulsion, and I think you have a photo of that, right? And
Yes.
we not only invited them to be a part of the program, they helped us plan the program. And our wonderful friend from the community, Anna Kenyon, she shared ideas that we didn't even think of from the Park Service perspective. She was the one that mentioned that it should be a walk, a memorial walk, instead of just kind of a presentation. She mentioned that we should include African-American gospel or church music as well. And so you can imagine it was incredibly powerful. And in many ways, it was because of their direct participation in that program. And I guess we can get back to your former slide about, how you guys do interpretation. I'd love to hear. I talked to my superintendent today. He talked about bringing his Appomattox staff, interp staff, to Montpelier several years ago. And I know we went there as well as a group of MPS staff, kind of off duty. And we kind of all visited it by ourselves that day, walking through the grounds. And I was pretty overwhelmed, obviously in a positive way, profoundly affected by the cellar and the interpretation that you guys have of the enslaved population and their experience at Montpelier. And so as before I turn this over to you, obviously, we work with other parks, of course, national parks, but working with organizations such as yours gives us a great insight about how to do this, right? About how to share techniques and approaches and things like that.
Yes, no, I absolutely appreciate your point about kind of elevating the stories that we tell. You know, coming from a public history background as well, you know, we learn that interpretation is about making a very intentional decision about what stories that, you know, you're going to share with people and, you know, what, you know, you're not going to share. And so I think you make a good point about, you know, it's not enough to just interpret the history of slavery, but, you know, your park, it sounds like, is very active in working with descendants and stakeholders and, you know, other community members in telling these stories. So I think that underscores the fact that this is really a collaborative process. And you're referencing the mere distinction of color, which is an exhibit that went in 2017, an award-winning exhibit. And, you know, even since then, since 2017, Montpelier has been doing, you know, work on this front. So what you see here is called the rubric for engaging descendant communities. And this is something that was the result of a gathering in 2018 with the National Trust for Historic Preservation and Montpelier, you know, in collaboration with teachers, activists, museum and historic site professionals, and perhaps most importantly, descendants were involved in this as well. So this document really kind of sets forth best practices in the field for interpreting slavery. And it's really kind of, you know, landmark moment, this rubric, because it's the first national interdisciplinary effort to really formulate kind of a model for interpreting slavery in collaboration with descendants. So that's something obviously that we do at Montpelier that's very important. And it's just exciting to think about the potential. As you said, you know, Montpelier is dedicated to this whole truth history. So it's not rewriting history, it's broadening it and it's having a better, more accurate understanding of history. So, I mean, that's really exciting. It's an opportunity to learn more. And so I'm curious to hear a little bit more about what you all at Camp Nelson have planned in the future projects. As you said, you know, you're a new site. I know you guys were designated in 2018, but bureaucracy can be a slow beast. So you mentioned just having your first staff meeting the other day.
Well, I appreciate your insight with that. And I actually shared this with my staff as well. And I think we'll certainly incorporate it as part of our new staff training this summer when we have our new interns and new volunteers that come into the park, and that will be directly communicating and interacting with the public, right? And so I think we gain a little bit of everything. We gain a little bit more insight from each place that we're at, the people that we interact with. So I know Elizabeth mentioned, and you just mentioned as well, you know, I served on detail as the chief of interp at Charles Young Buffalo Soldiers National Monument, a relatively new national park site. And talk about a direct connection to the Civil War, to civil rights and beyond, right? And so I don't think a lot of people realize Charles Young was born in 1864 in Kentucky. He was born enslaved in Kentucky. His father, because of proximity, did not go south. He went north and enlisted in the U.S. colored troops in Ohio. Okay, and then will serve for about a year up until 1866, and then after the war, he'll move his family to Ohio, and they're gonna raise Charles there. I think for those that don't know, Charles Young was the third African American graduate of West Point, the first National Park Service, a Black superintendent at Kings Canyon and Sequoia in 1903. And he was the highest ranking Black officer at the time of his death in the early 1920s. But it's a legacy as well, right? And I think so. His father was obviously affected by his experience in the United States colored troops. So after his son graduated from high school, there was an opportunity for him to apply for admission to West Point. And it was his father that encouraged him to do it, right? There's a really great photo of his father, Gabriel Young, and that's really the only image that we really have of his father. And he's got a GAR, you know, Grand Army of the Republic medal on his coat. You know, he's a veteran. He's very proud of his service in the Civil War, and it really affected, I think, really the way, you know, he brought his son up, values and things like that. So Charles has this military career, but Charles also mentored an entire generation of Black soldiers, including young Black officers, notably, Benjamin Davis Sr., who was the first Black general officer in 1940, and his son was the fourth Black graduate of West Point after Charles Young. It took over 30 years for that to happen, by the way. And Benjamin Davis Jr. is the commander. He became the commander of the Tuskegee Airmen. So you see all these connections here, right? It's incredibly powerful, but yeah, you can see the image of the luminaria there. So what are we working on now? Everything. It's been an exciting time at Camp Nelson. We have a very inspired staff. As I mentioned, we're working with the community members, partners, stakeholders, but we're also working with internal park support staff as well. So our long range interpretive plan will start in the fiscal year 23. We're excited about that to kind of get that going. What's this interpretive division going to look like within the next year? Developing a new park film, a wayside project, a new park museum, education program, right? And so there's a lot going on right now. We're turning the wheels. I feel like we're kind of hamsters sometimes because we're continually running, right? But it's really exciting. We've got a great superintendent that really supports the staff, and we have this shared vision of what this park's going to look like, right? And so, yeah, to be determined, obviously, but we want people to come to Camp Nelson, to go to Abraham Lincoln Birthplace, to Mill Springs, and all these Civil War sites in Kentucky to gain a deeper meaning into the complexities of emancipation, of the military, of refugees, and the legacy of the Civil War, of the Constitution, right? Civil War, civil rights, and what's next, right? And beyond. And so, yeah, so that's, obviously if they want more information, go to our website. We've got social media pages. Just look up Camp Nelson National Monument, and we'd love to connect with you if you're a local group or an educator, right? Or if you're just planning to visit the park, we're here for you. So that's kind of my thoughts. What are your, anything you got to add to this, Katie? And for us, it's a very exciting time. And as I mentioned to you and Elizabeth when we were first chatting before this video began, one of the things that we say all the time at Camp Nelson is it's a first. Here's another first. As we mentioned, yesterday was our first all-employee staff meeting, and it was super exciting, right? Because when I started on detail here, there was 4 of us. The visitor center wasn't open; it was still being renovated. We didn't have any frontline staff. And 2 of us were on detail, right? And so to even see now the development of the park has been really exciting. And by the way, that Luminaria program, we had almost 100 people there on a very frigid November evening. And so to see obviously the community support of that, there was a family that came all the way down from Cincinnati to attend that program, and she had an ancestor that served in the U.S. colored troops, right? And so we're just beginning, my friend, and we're very excited to be here.
That's so awesome. I hope to get the opportunity to visit, and it sounds like you and your staff will have to come to Montpelier.
Absolutely.
But I want to turn it over to the audience now. We do have a couple of questions in the chat, so I want to address those while we still have some time. Because I know you and I, Steve, could just go on and on.
Yeah, well, so I saw, Katie, that someone mentioned that our local group, just read Embattled Freedom by Dr. Amy Taylor. And thanks for sharing that comment. By the way, she's going to be our guest speaker at the Winter Lecture Series in March. So very, very exciting. And she talks about these refugee camps. I think for the past 20 or even 30 years, I think a lot of historians have been talking about contrabands, right? The U.S. Army basically accepting enslaved people in the federal lines from states that are in rebellion. They're considered contraband of war, right? Because they're used by property by the enemy, right? But what about the status of refugees, right? This kind of uncertain status. Her research is incredible, and she writes an entire chapter about Camp Nelson. So for those that are interested in learning more about Camp Nelson, the refugee experience for enslaved people, she kind of does these test studies across the country, right? And I think that's an exceptional book, and we're excited to have her at the park. So yes.
It looks like just from the chat that there's a lot of folks from Kentucky that
Oh,
are
wonderful.
joining in. Yeah. And Steve, do you mind just telling us a little bit about how you got interested in the Civil War in the first place and kind of what your journey was for this topic?
Wow, that's a great question. And it actually I shared it. I shared actually as a part of my family heritage actually. So my family is from Vietnam, South Vietnam. My father served in the war for the South Vietnamese military. Um, my mother actually married an American soldier and left Vietnam, I believe in 1973. My father fled Vietnam right before Saigon fell, and they were refugees. So my family were war refugees, and they actually ended up in Denver. My mother got divorced after a few years, and then Denver was one of the refugee cities. So believe it or not, my parents met in Denver of all places. So you've got two Vietnamese refugees from different parts of Vietnam meeting in Denver, and so they got married and they had me and my two brothers. Um, my parents never talked about the Vietnam War, understandably, right? My father was 19 when he fled Vietnam. I just learned recently, within the last several years, that my mother had a brother that was 19 and was killed in action, right? She never mentioned it. So you can imagine how traumatized they were by that experience. And obviously they had to flee their homes and their families and things like that. And so I think for me, my connection to the Civil War, I think personally, it was to kind of understand my own family's struggle as well, right? And so that's kind of the way I correlate it. And I'll share something really quick. And for the Civil War 150, sesquicentennial, the MPS published these kind of heritage books, right? And you've got a really great one about Asian and Pacific Islanders in the Civil War, and I got to be a part of that. And actually, my piece talks about like my own family's Civil War, right? Because it's interesting when you work at a Civil War site, and including like Camp Nelson, we have a lot of people that come in or contact us and be like, "Hey, I had an ancestor that served in this unit, right? Either USCT or even a white regiment. And you have more information about him and their service records and things like that. And it's really cool to connect with the public and have them make this connection to our cultural landscape, right? And it's really, and I think it's special that they share their family history with us as well, right? And interestingly, I can't say that my family served in the Civil War because they came over in the 1970s, right? But when I saw this photo of Joseph Pierce, this soldier of Chinese descent that served in the U.S. military during the Civil War, it kind of made me think about my family as well, right? And so that was kind of the start, understanding my own family's history. It's really come in spurts, right? Has really inspired this career. And I think amplifying these stories is, as I mentioned before, is kind of my mission. And being at a place as special as Camp Nelson is, I wouldn't want to be at any other Civil War park or site in the country right now.
Thank you for sharing that, Steve. That was a really wonderful personal, connection, and it kind of underscores the power of stories. Whether it's your own personal story, you can still kind of, find common connections and kind of power in other people's stories. So yeah, it's just really important to share these with the public. And I just want to note that Karen Armstrong shared a link to the Frankfurt Juneteenth
Oh, thanks, Karen.
event. Yeah, thank you. And if any of you Kentucky folks are ever in Virginia, you should attend Montpelier's Juneteenth. It's quite a large gathering. So hopefully there'll be more kind of cross connections between our sites, Steve.
Yeah, and I would say that for Karen, thank you. I see her comments throughout. Thank you so much. I'm really interested to see the Frankfurt Juneteenth program, and I really appreciate you sharing Juneteenth, the history of Juneteenth programs around Central Kentucky. I'm not sure, Karen, if you've been to Camp Nelson, but our visitor center is open Wednesday through Sunday, 9 to 5. I'd love for you to at some time come in and talk to us and our staff and share these programs and collaborate with you. It's a real privilege to have you as a part of this as well. Thank you so much.
And, Steve, you and I could talk about this all night, but I know that we are kind of coming up on our hour. And to address Loretta's question, yes, the recording will be available on Montpelier's website, probably in the coming weeks, I would say. It'll probably be a couple weeks. But I'm just really glad that we got to have this conversation, Steve. It's just been really great to kind of learn more about the Civil War, and again, kind of the connections between, James Madison, the writing of the Constitution in the 1780s, juxtaposed with the Civil War in the 1860s. So that was really cool.
Definitely. And I guess last word, thank you so much. This has been amazing. And I look forward, obviously an honor for us to be here. I'm just a representative of our park and the National Park Service, of course. But look forward to seeing what the rest of the series looks like moving forward. And obviously invite, the attendees to come out to Camp Nelson or even look for us online. I mean, I think a lot of people have been to Civil War sites, but this is such an exciting time for us. For us, I feel like we're the major leagues right now. Places like Appomattox, minor leagues, come and join us and come check out our site. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening, and stay tuned to both the Camp Nelson website and the Montpelier website for more awesome events like this one.
Yep. And thank you for everyone joining us. Really appreciate it.
Yes. Thank you. Bye, everyone.